Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Roaring Stories author event at the wonderful, historic Royal Oak Hotel in Sydney's Balmain and on Facebook Live. I'm Sunil Badami, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this, well, what I think will be a fascinating and enthralling wander through the Golden Maze with our guest.
That was sci-fi, wasn't it?
We should have done a little bit of a sound check, shouldn't we?
Oh, see, Sunil's only allowed 4 puns a night, and that's his 4th one for the evening, and so no more from now on, yes.
Well, I should say before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we meet, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I should also say, as a little by way of housekeeping, please make sure that your phones are on silent. You're welcome to take photos if you'd like. Just make sure your flashes are off. And if you do, feel free to share your photos on Instagram, Facebook, what other social media is there? Twitter. Look for Roaring Stories and make sure you put in the hashtags Roaring Stories and Golden Maze. As well, if you haven't, please make sure that you do sign in and register with your phones. It's a very convenient Q code to make sure that we can contact trace you in case, but we hope not, anyone does get sick. You know, Richard, I have been working on a social distancing joke, but I only got this far.
Oh dear. No.
Please don't spread it around. We don't want it to go viral, okay?
Oh.
I know, it's a bit of a sick joke, isn't it?
Oh.
Have I reached my limit yet?
You've gone way past it. That's 3 more than allowed.
We are in the middle of a pandemic, Richard. Now, don't forget, if you are on Facebook Live, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as well as everyone in the audience. Just make sure that you post your question on the Roaring Stories Facebook Live page, and I'll make sure that I read it out for you at the end of the session. I'm really looking forward to this. So, it is one of the world's most beautiful cities. The home of the Bohemians, writers, composers, golems, robots, and giant cockroaches. And yet, despite being closer to the west than it is to the east, the storied and beautiful city of Prague remains for many of us as mysterious and beguiling as ever. This evening we'll discover presenter, musician and best-selling author Richard Fidler's passion for Prague as we explore the winding streets, the turbulent history and the ancient landmarks of the Golden Maze with him in this biography of a city. Now, does Richard need any introduction? He's the author of the best-selling books The Ghost Empire and co-writer with Kari Gislason of the best-selling Sagaland, which was awarded the 2018 Indie Non-Fiction Book of the Year. You may also know him from his day job as the presenter of Conversations on ABC Radio, the most popular podcast in Australia. And in another life, Richard was the good-looking member of one of my favourite bands as a kid, the Australian comedy trio and Canberra legends, the Doug Anthony All-Stars. And as I say, his new book, The Golden Maze, is a biography of one of his favourite cities. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Hello, everyone. Hello.
Now, Richard, before we dive into The Golden Maze with you, how about we hear a little bit about the Golden Maze? Why don't you read us a little bit from the book?
Sure. I'll read a part from the book, from a chapter called The Second Culture. This is the period that's commonly known as normalisation, which is one of the weirdest periods of Prague's history. This is after the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968, when total control by the party was brought to bear on Prague once more and on Czech society at large. And there was the construction of a kind of complex surveillance state where people were encouraged to spy on each other. The secret police were ever present and no one could really trust anyone else. It was a very tricky period. After the Velvet Revolution, when the communist state fell and the secret police records were made available, people discovered that brothers had been reporting on their sisters, wives against their husbands. People in the dissident movement thought that some of their closest comrades who'd be with them forever. They discovered that they too had been reporting to the secret police. The point of it all was to atomise trust between people, because you need trust to form an opposition to the government. So to cope with it, there were a lot of jokes that were being told in Prague at the time. The ear. 3 apparatchiks came to Prague one month for a party conference. After the first day, they sat up late in their hotel room, drinking, telling stories. The alcohol loosened their tongues a little, and they began to complain about the secret police. One of them hushed the other two and whispered, "What if they're listening to us right now?" The other two laughed. So the man decided to play a joke. He went downstairs to the hotel reception and asked the woman at the desk to deliver 3 cups of tea to the room in 15 minutes. When he rejoined his friends, he sat down and leant towards a vase of plastic flowers and said, "Hello, Comrade Major. Could you have 3 cups of tea sent up to our room?" His friends laughed, but when the tea arrived, they blanched, made their excuses, and went to bed. The next morning, the man went out for a walk, but when he returned to the hotel, his friends were gone. He asked the receptionist what had happened to them. "They've been arrested," she said. "They would have arrested you too, but the Comrade Major really liked your joke about the tea." The dread that one's conversation might be overheard was the subject of many jokes from this time. Some were long, shaggy dog stories. Others achieved a kind of pithy perfection. An American visits a Czech relative in Prague. "How are things going?" he asks. "Oh, you know," replies the Czech. "Can't complain." The secret police devoted enormous resources to keeping tabs on troublemakers. The dissident writer Ludwig Vaculik and his wife Madla discovered tiny microphones hidden in every room in their apartment. Their phone was bugged, and another apartment in their block was taken over by STB, secret police agents, to monitor their conversations. Thus, for 20 years, they avoided discussing anything of significance out loud and wrote it down instead on flushable sheets of toilet paper. It's hard to overstate the sheer weirdness of normalisation. Amid the dullness, there was a through-the-looking-glass quality to daily life in which people were expected to accept 6 impossible things before breakfast. The terrible dinginess, the shortages, the suppression of honest opinion were at odds with President Husak's claim that life was getting better and sweeter. Communism seemed both unsustainable and unkillable. In 2018, on a long 4-hour flight from Perth to Sydney, I fell into conversation with a woman sitting next to me, Anna, who had grown up in communist Poland. I asked her if she'd ever travelled to Czechoslovakia during those years, and she recalled spending a summer at a friendship camp in Spitzak near the German border with a group of other kids from the Soviet bloc. One day, she said, the camp administrator informed them that an important party dignitary would be visiting to make a speech, and they would have to make the camp look nice for the official photographs. But there was a problem, Anna explained. The lawn in front of the hostel had dried out, so all of us were given buckets of green paint to make it look good for the cameras. "You painted the lawn green?" I asked. "We painted the lawn green." "With brushes or rollers?" "No, with brushes," she said. "So what happened when the party dignitaries came?" "Well, they came, they made their speeches, of course. The happy photos were taken, and after they left, the lawn completely died." I had to ask if the news pictures of the event were published in colour or in black and white. "Oh, black and white," she said, smiling. Thank you.
Now, Richard, you've written books on subjects as diverse and varied as the history of rock and roll, Australian rock and roll in Real Wild Child, of Byzantine sunken navies, sagas in Iceland, and now Prague. Is there a connection? What draws you to these subjects, and is there a connection between them?
Well, the 3 books, one on Byzantium or Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. The second was on, as you say, the Icelandic sagas, and this one on Prague. I think all of them have a remoteness. There's a lack of familiarity in English-speaking countries for towards these places. We're held distant from them by language most of the time and their sheer strangeness. they also have a kind of, I think, a kind of complexity and majesty to them. Even Iceland, the stories of the Viking sagas, as coarse as they are, have a fineness and majesty and largeness to them that completely fascinates me. And it also occurred to me as I was starting to write this book, and I don't know what the significance of this is that Constantinople is on the threshold of Europe and Asia. Right on, you cross the Bosphorus and you're in Asia once you do that in Istanbul. Iceland is on the threshold of Europe and the Americas. And Prague is in the absolute pretty much dead centre of Europe. So I've probably got nowhere else to go after this in geographic terms. But I like telling stories of cities in particular and places because you can write about a lot of different things. So with this I was able to write, of course, about the sweep of history, the brilliant and terrible rulers, the great tragedy of the 20th century of Prague, its glorious release in the Velvet Revolution, but also to write about composers, music and science. Johannes Kepler lived in Prague during the Renaissance era, and it was under the patronage of the great Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II, who made Prague his capital, and it was there that he decoded the secret of planetary motion. Albert Einstein lived in Prague for a brief time, which is where he did much of the work for his general theory of relativity. And while he was there, he attended a regular salon in the old town square of Prague. This is just pre-World War I, held by a woman called Berta Fanta. And another regular Jewish Prager that went along to these salons was Franz Kafka. And it seems that there was one night where Einstein gave a lecture at the salon on his special theory of relativity, which is all about how the speed of light is the kind of universal cosmic speed limit. And we're pretty sure Franz Kafka was there with his friend Max Brod. Neither of them wrote about meeting each other. Kafka certainly never wrote about anything to do with Einstein's science. But nonetheless, these two critical figures who are so important to the way we see the world and the universe were there in the same salon in this extraordinary city at the same time. So these places allow me to write about all kinds of different things, which is so much fun for me.
I mean, Prague is a city in a very small country that has generally been overshadowed by its neighbours, and I'm reminded of the who you call the father of Czech nationhood, Vladsky, saying that
Thomas Masaryk, yeah. Which one you were talking about? The first president, Thomas Masaryk?
No, I'm thinking about. Sorry, now I haven't got his name here. František Palacký.
Oh, František Palacký.
He talked about, known as the father of Czechoslovakia, he said that our small nation is a nation of itself and based on its own strength. But why was Prague such a magnet and a centre for so many incredibly creative people, whether in the sciences, in music, in literature?
I think it's right at the centre of Europe. That's a big part. And although it's the capital of, certainly the capital of Bohemia, which is the province of the Czech people. It's also been a place, though, where Bohemian Germans lived for centuries and Bohemian Jewish people lived for centuries as well, until they were very largely murdered by the Nazis during the Nazi occupation. So it's always been at the crossroads of Europe. The name itself means threshold, which is a wonderful thing. And it suits the name, it suits the city so beautifully. So there's always been this tension throughout its history between, are we going to be a Czech city and be unto ourselves as Czech people and with a distinctive identity as opposed to the kind of the German societies that are all around us, or are we going to be this mix, this kind of multicultural place? And that's a tension that was only really resolved after the Second World War, when, full of righteous vengeance, the Czechs kicked the Germans out of Czechoslovakia. And today, the Czechs are pretty homogenous. There's a kind of Vietnamese minority, some Slovak gypsy people who live there as well, Romani people I should say. But they've now got that thing. They've got a nation more or less unto themselves. And I think while they're pretty happy with that, I think they're a smaller nation for that.
Now, you've got a very personal story, and amidst all of these wonderful fairy tales and this history, you've got your own personal history about Prague. What drew you to Prague in the first place, and why You know, how's it changed since that first visit?
Well, I'm sure a lot of people here remember. You remember like what was called Europe's Year of Miracles, 1989, when the whole wave, there was a wave of revolutions across Eastern and Central Europe where the old Stalinist police states sort of were knocked down one by one under a wave of popular revolutions. That was because Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, just let it be known that he wasn't prepared to back up those regimes with Soviet tanks. And that was really the thing that was in the final instance, keep propping those regimes up in the face of the opposition of their own people. So one by one they fell down. I was living in London at the time, performing with that grubby comedy trio that I was a member of for those years. And we were doing a London theatre season, and I was sort of jumping out of my skin watching the BBC, seeing like Poland change government, Hungary, then East Germany, Berlin, the Berlin Wall falls. And I could see earth-moving equipment pulling slabs of the concrete wall out like sort of rotten teeth out of the ground. And people dancing on top of the segments of the Berlin Wall and spilling champagne everywhere. And I just longed to be there, to sort of be a witness to this historic moment. So as soon as the theatre season ended, my girlfriend at the time and I went to Berlin, and that's a whole other story to tell, our time in Berlin, and then to Prague, which was in this kind of fizzy aftermath of the Velvet Revolution, which was their own peaceful uprising against the puppet state that had been put in place by Stalin. And it's one of the most moving experiences of my entire life to be in Prague in the middle of this joyous revolution where suddenly people felt they had their future back. They could look forward to the future again. And this was also a time that was at the end of the Cold War. And I felt I was getting my future back because I was really convinced in my early 20s that I wasn't going to live to see the age of 30. I mean, it's kind of forgotten now, but the early 80s were a time of where nuclear tensions between the superpowers were at their absolute height, and the window for reaction time at a nuclear strike was just brought down to minutes. And I used to have conversations when I was in Canberra with my fellow students at ANU, and we'd say, so if there was nuclear war, would we be annihilated, or would we just sort of die a slow choking death in a nuclear winter? These aren't good conversations for young people to be having, and it sort of made me quite a pessimistic person. So the end of the Cold War, symbolised by the Velvet Revolution and my experience of it, I think turned me from a pessimist into an optimist. There was one night, can I tell the story? There was one night, my girlfriend and I, it was the anniversary of the self-immolation of a young man called Jan Palach. In 1969, to protest the Soviet invasion, this young student poured petrol on his head at the top of Wenceslas Square and set fire to himself. And this was agony for Prague. It took him several days to die. And his funeral was attended by hundreds of thousands of people. It was spectacularly tragic. And people kept trying to commemorate his death at the top of Wenceslas Square every year, but it was illegal and they'd have water cannons put on them. So this was the first legal remembrance of the death of Jan Palach. And Josephine and I went to this shrine, this kind of wedding cake of melted candle wax and notes and to Jan Palach. And two soldiers approached us, two young guys, they were teenagers, wearing greatcoats that were too big for them. And one of them came to me, his name was Jan, and he said, "Pivo, pivo." And I have very little Czech, but I know that means beer. And I said, you beer, yes, I thought it'd be fun for us to talk to soldiers, wouldn't that be a hoot? So I said, yes, we're here at the Grand Hotel Europa, come and drink beer with us, yes, pivo, yes. And he went, oh, American. And I went, no, Australian. And he said, oh, Australia. And he went, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Canberra. And I went, wow, you know your geography. He went, yes, Australia. And then he went, AC/DC. And he went, Angus. And he went, and he was playing like air guitar in the middle of Wenceslas Square and sort of doing Angus Young sort of, bunny hop. And we were falling about laughter, and his mate, the other soldiers, going rolling his eyes, like that. So I said, yeah, come and drink beer with us. And there was this other guy standing nearby. Josephine just reminded me of this when I saw her a couple of months ago. There was another guy standing by who sort of had a comb over. He was a really dodgy looking guy with a briefcase, and he was just standing there, and he went, Kylie Minogue. Kylie Minogue, lucky. And then he said, nice girl. And we didn't invite him to drink beers with us, but he followed us along anyway. And we sat down at the table, and he sat at an adjacent table drinking Bekharovka and raising his glass to us, like this. And meanwhile, Jan the soldier, Jan's mate was trying to hit on my girlfriend. She was trying to fend him off. Jan, though, became, after 2 pots of beer, actually it's more like 2 vases of beer. That's what they serve beer in Prague. He became quite emotional, and he said to me, "Richard, we are friends, yes?" And I said, "Yes, we are friends." He said, "Richard, listen to me, please. Czechoslovakia, Australia, Germany, Poland, America, one world, please. One world, please, please, Richard, please." I said, "Yes, yes, this is lovely." And he said, "Listen, Richard, please listen to me." "Yes, I'm listening." And he's Czechoslovakia, Australia, America, Germany, Russia. And at that point, Mr. Nice Girl, sitting in the corner, leapt out of his chair and went bang on the table, went, "No Russia, not Russia, no, no Russia, no, no." And he said something to me in Czech, flung open his briefcase, and there were all these yellow sort of photostat cop sheets, and he just flung this stuff in this dense Czech in front of me, and then stormed out. And it was like, and we're all pretty pissed at this point too, and we're going, "What was that about? What just happened?" And Jan just sort of looked back at me and went, "Richard, listen to me, please. Czechoslovakia, Australia, one world, please, one world." And because he was getting his future back too. You know, if there'd been a nuclear strike, he's living right on the border of on the Iron Curtain, right on the border where his whole village, his whole country would have been obliterated. So suddenly all of us can look to a future again. So, sorry, it's a very long-winded answer, Sunil, but that's why, part of the reason why it was so moving. That and the sheer strange beauty of Prague, it completely overwhelmed me, and I never forgot it.
But Richard, it's a book you've said, you know, has taken you 30 years to write. And after hearing a story that you've literally pulled out of the well of memory so vividly, what took you so long?
What took me so long? I think I had to, well, I went back a year and a half after the Velvet Revolution with Kim, my wife, who's here tonight, and that was a little odd. I mean, you know, that was past all the euphoria, and everyone was running around trying to, you know, get rich and enjoy the new capitalist economy, such as it was. And then I didn't go back for such a long time, and not until 2018. You know, we had kids, and you can't travel as much when you have kids. I didn't go overseas for about 10 years. It was always in my mind to write a book about Prague and to try and, first of all, talk about my own stories about being there, but also kind of decode its really long and tumultuous history, to understand it better myself. But I think I had to be at an age where I could have enough distance from myself as a young man and understand that about myself and understand better why I was so profoundly moved by that experience of being there. And I think you have to forgive your younger self too, don't you? You have to forgive yourself your foolishness and your short-sightedness and all the things you got wrong. You can stand back and still see all that about yourself and go, "Oh, that's all right, you know, that's okay." So I think I just needed the time and the perspective.
I mean, I'm always struck when I look at photographs of myself as a young person is, oh my God, those clothes look terrible, but you wear them so well. Now, yes. How did you know, you've accomplished so much in so many different fields: comedy, music, TV, radio. What made you leap into history, and why are you drawn to history?
I don't know if I had great accomplishments in TV for a start. I think I was always barely hanging on by my fingernails and that, and I didn't have much fun in TV, to be honest. I love radio though. Radio is so
I've been told I've got a great face for it.
Yes, me too. I've been told that too. I've always been a lover of history. My dad was, both my parents were big readers. They both grew up during the Great Depression and the Second World War. From very, very poor families, dirt poor families. And so they had that reverence for reading and for education and for books that only the really, truly poor have, I think. You know, they really understood, you know, when books are the only beautiful thing in front of you, that's become so important to you. My dad was a big history reader, and I always grew up seeing like huge panels of hardbacks on his bookshelf. And when I got old enough to read them, I'd take them down and read them myself. I used to tour a lot with the old comedy group. We'd go touring around Britain and Australia, spending hours and hours in a stinky Tarago. And I read a lot of history. I had an undergraduate arts degree, but it was sort of like my second arts degree in a way, was to sort of just do all the reading I did while I was on tour. And I don't know, I suppose I've always wanted to write a book like that. you know, my dad's not with us anymore, but I would love to have seen his face if I could have put that book on his shelf one day. I think that's all part of it too. And so, yeah, the idea of creating something that's a book is a really lovely thing for me, because radio is lovely to make and it's glorious to make, but it's so evanescent. It sort of goes out into the ether, and there's nothing you can sort of hold in your hands. So that's I suppose that's the best answer I can give to your question.
And look, as a little bit of an aside, a really beautiful kind of benediction leading on from that story. Your mum's friend Beth turned up tonight to return one of her books. Thanks so much, Beth.
Yeah, thank you, Beth.
She's watching at home on Facebook Live now. Yeah. And remember, if you are on Facebook Live and you would like to ask Richard a question, don't forget to post your question on the Roaring Stories Facebook page, and I will try to read it out for you later on tonight. Well, you're into history, but what's the difference between the history of a city and the biography of a city, as you've described the Golden Maze?
Well, biography was a way of just I suppose, an imprecise way of describing how I write about history, which is I put personal stories from myself in there. There's a bit of travel writing in there from me, obviously. And also I like to insert myths and legends about a city, because I think they're always a joy to read for me. And they also tell you about something about the underlying obsessions of a society. And so it's a style a way of writing history that I've sort of hit upon that I enjoy. And so it's not a kind of classic history in that sense, although it does follow the huge arc of history, but there are a lot of detours going into the personal. There's some personal stories from me there, and like I say, myths and legends. So I suppose it's history plus Sunil, if you want to, history and other stuff that seem to sort of fit into the puzzle of it.
Now, how have historians responded to your work, and how have Czech people responded to your work?
Well, so far pretty well. I don't know, maybe the historians that don't like it just have got the kindness not to say anything, but I've had several, like Brasidas Karalis, who is a historian at Sydney University, was really lovely about Ghost Empire. In fact, has had his students read it as part of their coursework. Which was terribly wonderful. I also met China's leading Byzantine historian when I was in Beijing, and had a wonderful conversation with him. He was lovely too. But the Czech people, I haven't really had a full response yet, but I have a couple of friends who live in Prague, one of whom is a Czech author himself who appears in this book, Marek Toman. I hope Marek likes it. That means a great deal to me, what Marek thinks of it. I hope he really enjoys it.
Now, we're often reminded that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it, and I was struck by the conditions that gave rise to the 1848 revolution in the Austro-Hungarian, or the Holy Roman Empire at the time, before it became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I was struck where you wrote about how the new factories in Bohemia made Bohemia an industrial dynamo and enriched their owners far beyond those who worked for them. That the population drift emboldened into the city, emboldened employers to cut workers' wages again and again while demanding longer hours. And young, educated Praguers and Bohemians became frustrated by the lack of employment opportunities or advancement to those outside of the elite.
Doesn't sound like anything like how things are now, Sunil, does it? It really doesn't describe the situation today at all, does it? No.
No. How can history help us understand the present and prevent repeating the mistakes of the past?
There are all sorts of warnings in this book, I like to think, in any case. Particularly about the warning about what happens when you just stop caring about liberal democracy, I suppose. My whole experience in Prague left my orientation, I suppose, very firmly towards liberal democracy, and to be deeply suspicious, in fact hostile towards utopian solutions, which, as Milan Kundera has a lovely phrase for this. He said, many times in the past people have set up utopian societies, but shortly after they do set up their little society, they need to put a little concentration camp on the side. and over time, the concentration camp gets bigger and the society gets smaller. And this has happened again and again. The idealists who began the revolution, they can become some of the cruelest enforcers of the utopian dream that they're trying to uphold. He said that when it came to communism, a lot of Prague's intellectuals in the 1950s who rebelled in the 1960s, back in the 1950s, were often the proudest supporters of the party, even as it persecuted people, even as it set up show trials of innocent people and hanged them by cords, not by nooses, but by cords. You know, Milan Kundera was one of them himself. He wrote vile poems praising Stalin in the 1950s. And he was the one still thinking that something could be salvaged out of socialism with a human face after the Soviet invasion of '68. And he quickly, of course, realised there was nothing to be done for that. And he, in the end, wrote from France some of the most penetrating and powerful attacks on Soviet communism and Marxist-Leninism as well. So I suppose that teaches us what can go wrong there. And you can also see a lot of backsliding in Eastern Europe today, where Poland and Hungary have both given away all those democratic gains of 1989 and have settled instead for majoritarian, authoritarian regimes. This is what happens when all the young people leave too, and it's a kind of a vicious cycle. I understand now increasingly that that's a reaction to the departure of a lot of talented young people from those two countries. But Czech Republic's a little different. They've got a very interesting president and prime minister there now, and I don't mean interesting in a nice way either. But nonetheless, talented young people have chosen to stay in Prague and in the rest of the Czech Republic. So there's still hope that they can hold their civil society together and their democratic, human rights-based society together.
Speaking of Kundera, I mean, one of his most famous works, apart from The Unbearable Lightness of Being, in which he talks about Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence, was The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, which kind of describes both the tragedy and the comedy of many of the, you know, situations you mentioned in your first reading at the beginning of our chat. I mean, it's interesting because the first president of the free Czechoslovakia and then later the Czech Republic was Václav Havel, who was most famous, apart from his dissension, for being an absurdist playwright. What role has absurdism played in addressing and, I guess, redressing the Czechs' fraught history?
Absurdism is everything to the Czechs. They are brilliant practitioners of absurdist humour. It happens again and again and again. The initiator of this was an author called Jaroslav Hašek, who wrote The Good Soldier Švejk, which is the most hilarious book. Hilarious book. It's about a buffoon of a soldier who's running a dog fancier salon, who makes money by picking up stray mongrels in Prague, dyeing their fur different colours and selling them as exquisite rare breed dogs to people in Prague. And then he goes and joins the Austro-Hungarian army. And his tactic is to play the buffoon to 110%. Like, he fills every order to 110%, to the point where it completely destroys the whole point of the order in the first place. He's so ultra enthusiastic, it infuriates everyone, but no one can quite deal with him. And that's how the Czechs have time and time again resisted the foreign tyrannies that have been imposed on them. Firstly by Nazi Germany and then by Stalinist Russia. They're forever taking the piss. After the Soviet invasion of 1968, people were walking around with transistor radios close to their ears to get the latest news from the BBC or the Voice of America or whatever. And so Soviet soldiers and the secret police went around confiscating these transistors. So Praguers then went around with blocks of coal held up to their ears, pretending to listen to that, and then they were confiscated as well. In 1988, as a kind of a precursor, it was a sign that things were starting to move again. In 1988, there was a group that formed, called themselves the Society for a Merrier Present, and they organised this kind of militaristic march over the Charles Bridge, wearing helmets made out of watermelons, carrying salami sticks for truncheons, and holding up banners with blank sheets for banners which had nothing written on them. And the police panicked and confiscated the banners, which of course brings people, laughing again. Laughing at power is I think the Czechs have a genius for that, and it's helped them cope psychologically.
I mean, one of my favourite Czech national heroes, who apparently has more streets and squares named after him than anyone else, is of course Jara the Chimmerman.
Oh, he's a fictional character, isn't he?
Apocryphal,
yeah.
I think he'd prefer you'd say. Apparently the Czechs believe that he discovered yogurt.
Yeah, they do that. The story of Prague is full of so many hoaxes and pranks and things, weird coincidences as well. The best example I can think of that is my friend Jaroslav Kovaček. Do people here remember Jaroslav when he was an ABC Classic FM broadcaster here in Australia? I was a fan of his in the 80s. I used to listen to his show. It was called Akustika Nova, Jaroslav Kovaček. And he'd play avant-garde music, amazing avant-garde music late at night. And I looked him up, figuring, I knew he escaped after 1968, and I figured he'd have a good story. Have I got time to tell the story?
Of course you do.
Sunil? Kim and I drove up to his home on the north coast of New South Wales, and I got his story from him. In 1968, he was doing lots of different stuff in Prague. He was a musicologist. He graduated from the Charles University. He was part of a human rights organisation. Now, Jaroslav was never a communist, never a member of the Communist Party. He wanted Czechoslovakia, as it was then, to become like Austria, a neutral parliamentary democracy, a normal country, in other words. And he recalled on the night of the 20th of August 1968, going to a meeting where people were talking about socialism with a human face, and he went, oh yeah. And he came home after going to the pub, walking across the Legion Bridge from the National Theatre, and it was a cloudy night, but he could hear the sounds of planes buzzing overhead. And he went back to his apartment in Malá went to sleep, and 3 hours later was woken by a friend calling him saying, we've been invaded. And he went downstairs and could see tanks coming down the street, Soviet tanks. This was how the Soviet Union dealt with the experiment that the Czechs had with freedom of speech, freedom of travel, and human rights during the brief Prague Spring, was to shut it down completely. And later that morning, as the morning went on, he went into Wenceslas Square, where the tanks, Soviet tanks were. And people were just so outraged and distraught. They had no weapons in their hands, so they got chalked and drew swastikas on the back of the Soviet tanks, shouted at the soldiers who were told that they were going there to free the Czechs from a counter-revolution. And they didn't understand why they were being shouted at and screamed at so much. And then they started to freak out. Jaroslav was standing up near the top of Wenceslas Square, near where the National Museum is, near the statue of St. Wenceslas. That one of the tank turrets came around and opened fire on the crowd. And the guy next to him was shot, and Jaroslav and other people were shot dead. Jaroslav legged it up to Vinohradska to go towards the radio building, where he had friends. And he couldn't get through because there was a barricade there set up by protesters where they'd overturned a tram and set fire to it. Then he told me he turned and went down a side street, and there was a row of Soviet tanks. And the commander of one of the tanks popped his head out and did this to Jaroslav. And he told me, I don't know why I did it. I mean, this man was my enemy and I should hate him, but there was something compelling about this. And he got down from the tank and started walking towards Jaroslav, and Jaroslav came towards him. And the tank commander, when he got to Jaroslav, held him and burst into tears and said, I am so sorry, we shouldn't be here. We shouldn't have done this. I understand this now. I am so sorry. And Jaroslav started crying. And they got talking about what they were both, they're both young men, and this was all a nightmare. Right, Jaroslav spoke Russian, of course. And the guy said, oh God, this is terrible. I'm doing my military service. My wife in Leningrad's had a baby. I'm not going to see the baby for, I think, maybe 2 years or something. And this is terrible. And Yaroslav's, excuse language here, but Yaroslav's going, it's fucking politicians that does this. They separate people apart. It's terrible what they do. You know, we would have been friends. We should have been friends. So Jaroslav then decides to leave. He comes to Australia, has a whole new life here as a broadcaster with Classic FM, and is a very good broadcaster too, an outstanding one. And then 1989 rolls around, and he's in his living room watching TV, watching the Velvet Revolution unfold in Prague. You know, the day he thought would never come. The communists are being overthrown. And he gets a phone call from Jana Vent's office. Jana is of Czech heritage, Czech emigre parents. And Jana says to him, I want to fly you for a current affairs special back to Prague, so we can film you going back to Prague and visiting the graves of your parents. And he said, well, that'll be wonderful. So he does all that. He said it's very emotional. And he's walking across the Charles Bridge and he's seeing all these sights. He thought he'd never see Prague again. They finished filming and he had dinner with friends. And he said, I think I'll go into Wenceslas Square and have a sausage and a beer, because the beer's great. Like, it's near midnight. And he was in Wenceslas Square. And this is the same month I was there. It's possible we could have passed in the street at that point. He saw there was a bunch of young people singing songs with the guitar. And the singer was this really young guy, a Russian guy, playing guitar, singing. And Yaroslav's going, this is how it should be. People from all nations, you know, getting along, not letting politics get in the way. So we bought a beer for the young guy. the guitarist, and speaking to him in Russian and said, well, this is all very exciting. And the guy said, well, where are you from? He said, I'm from Australia, but I had to leave after 1968, but you wouldn't know about that, he said to the young guy. And the Russian guy says, oh, you mean the Soviet invasion? And he said, how do you know about that? Because the knowledge of that was suppressed. And he said, my father was a tank commander, and he came here from Leningrad, where I grew up, and he always, when he came back, I didn't see him for years until he came back, he told me it was a terrible mistake, that we should never have invaded Prague. And I was looking at Yaroslav, and he says, now I can't prove that that man was the tank commander's son, but I really think it was. I really think it was. And it forms such a beautiful symbolic function. It can be or it can't be. Take that story as you will. But when Yaroslav told me that story, I knew I had a book. That's for sure. Sorry, it's a long story, but it's worth telling, I think.
No, it's a great story. But, you know,
thank you.
Speaking of great stories, it's interesting. You talk about the Czech language being so singular and so strange, and yet it seems that Czech literature has cast, and Czech stories have cast such a wide shadow over our imaginations, from the golem in the ghetto to the robots from 1927 to Kafka's enormous cockroach. They're all so uncanny and inhuman. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Czech imagination has spread so far throughout the world?
Bohumil Hrabal, the great Czech writer, used to say that being so far from the ocean, the Czechs had to satisfy themselves with having an ocean of words instead. There are so many great Czech writers. I was a fan of Czech literature before I even went there, reading Milan Kundera, Josef Skvoretzky, it's hard to say his name, Skvoretzky, and Ivan Klima and Bohumil Hrabal, these great authors and important authors too. There's something about the nature of the city that it strikes a great many people as being uncanny, and it certainly had that effect on me. The first time I was there, I had this profound sense of déjà vu, which is a bit, solipsistic, but you think, that thing people say, I was meant to be in Prague, that kind of thing, and you go, stop that. But then I could finally put my finger on what that feeling was. And Prague is the landscape of the fairy tales and folk tales that many of us get as children, and then we leave behind and walk away from. And so there's this strange sense of homecoming to the imaginative landscapes of our childhood when you go to Prague. Particularly for those of us who've grown up in cities like Sydney or wherever in Australia, modern cities with skyscrapers, there's this deeply satisfying feeling going to a place like Prague. It feels magical because you're returning to that land of imagination you lived in when you were a kid. But these are the darker versions of those folk tales, not the Disney-fied, prettified versions. These are the versions where Cinderella's sisters lop off parts of their feet to fit them into the glass slipper. And the true story of Little Red Riding Hood, who strips naked to dance for the wolf at his command and then is devoured as she dances for him. I mean, these are stories that don't have happy endings. That's why Prague feels, it's part of the reason why it has that uncanny feel. A lot of writers coming through the place have noticed this. Patrick Leigh Fermor, who wrote The Time of Gifts, was there in 1935, was walking through it, and he was struck by that uncanniness as well. He said there were parts of the city where every detail seemed to be the tip of a whole host of inexplicable phantoms. André Breton, the founder of French Surrealism, was staggered by the city when he came with Paul Eluard in the same year, in 1935. And he sort of kind of sensed that the surrealist masterpiece of Prague was the city itself. So there's something about the nature of it, its winding streets, the shape of it, the jumble of medieval, Renaissance and Baroque and Cubist architecture that make it like nowhere else in the world.
So, what's your favourite place in Prague?
There are quite a few. I'm always pretty happy to be drinking coffee or beer in the Café Slavia on Narodny Street, which is on the corner of the Vltava embankment. So you can sort of sit there in this glorious Art Deco cafe, drinking coffee or beer, and looking at the Vltava River, the bridges, and Prague Castle in the distance. That's pretty lovely. That's pretty nice being there. Or just being in the Golden Tiger, the great literary pub in Prague, is kind of amazing too. You walk in there and they just bring a beer to your table, which I love. There's none of this kind of line, can I have a beer please? They just bring a beer to your table straight away. And on the back of a coaster, they put like a tiger scratch mark, just one single line. That's beer 1, right? And if you've got 5 scratches, then you're going to pay for 5 beers at the end of the night. The pubs, and cafes of Prague. Yeah, that's my happy place, Sunil.
Now, you mentioned that in an age where we can't travel, and we may not be able to travel for quite some time, I'm reminded of Somerset Maugham once saying that the wise man or wise person travels the world without leaving their room, simply by opening a book. But if we were to accompany you to Prague, not just in the pages of the book, but in our dreams, what would a perfect Prague day be for you, Richard?
To show people around Prague? Well, if someone hadn't been to Prague before, I would do the reverse route of the Royal Road, it's called, which is the road that the kings of Bohemia were brought, and queens of Bohemia were brought along to be on their way to their coronation at Prague Castle. I'd begin at Prague Castle, right on the hill, the bluff of Hrdčany, as it's called, where the spires of St. Vitus are. And there's all sorts of stories relating to that, really weird and wonderful stories around the church and around the various castle courtyards. Show them the palaces where Emperor Rudolf II had his Kunstkammer, his chamber of wonders, and where in the moat beyond, where he kept his menagerie of fabulous beasts. This was a kind of a collector of rare and wonderful things. And Rudolf II, who was there in the late 1500s, early 1600s, had a collection of lions and tigers, and he had a cassowary from New Guinea, a dodo from Mauritius, rare and exotic birds, the hide of a rhinoceros, and his favourite lion, Muhammad, who was allowed to roam freely around the castle. And we know this happened because there are documents from the court which saying, oh, we had to give so many ducats to poor old Jan over there who got mauled by Muhammad the other day while walking around, because he was a bit mean and stingy, old Rudolph, and could never quite afford to feed the lions properly. Can you imagine? And Muhammad would curl up at his feet while he held court, which kept court business pretty brisk, I'm imagining. So going from the castle courtyard, down this fabulous street, very touristy now, what are you going to do, called Neredova, named after the writer Jan Neruda. And this is a magical street because above every lintel there's a little sign, a strange symbol, which in the past, in the Baroque era, indicated the profession or the name of the person that lived there. There's two suns, where I think Kepler lived. There's a swan or a lobster or something like that, and they all have their own kind of magic significance. Then you go down into Malostranske Náměstí, and from there, in the lower part of the Malostrana, across the Charles Bridge, with its fabulous avenue of stone and bronze statues, which back at the time they were constructed would have seemed a little overbearing, I think, for Czech Protestants trying to cope with the forceful reimposition of Catholicism on them. You go across the Vltava River and suddenly the whole city is there before you as you cross this beautiful cobblestone bridge with these gorgeous towers on either end. And at the far end you pass into the old town, going past a statue of Charles IV, the emperor who built the Charles Bridge, the Charles University, the new town of Prague, and St. Vitus Cathedral. And then you go down this little street called Karlova Street, which is really lovely and winding. And as you go into Karlova Street, if you look above a jeweller shop, you see a yellow statue of Libuša, the mythical woman who founded the city of Prague. Now that's really rare. How many origin stories of a city do you know where the mythical founder is a woman instead of a man, like Romulus and Remus? And from there you pass inevitably into the Old Town Square and its astronomical clock. There's fabulous stories about that too. None of them are true, but they're great stories. The Old Town Square with its beautiful buildings. And then into the Jewish Quarter, the most tragic and most poignant part of Prague. And its fabulous Jewish cemetery with the headstones sort of jutting out like sort of broken teeth from the soil, and the old new synagogue. That'll keep you going for a couple of hours, I reckon. Yeah.
Well, now it's time for questions from you. If you're in the room, just call out your question and I'll repeat it for our friends on Facebook Live. And if you're on Facebook Live and you've posted a question, or you can still post a question, I'll read out that question too. Now, if you are asking a question, time is limited, so please no statements, ruminations or meanders. I will be listening for the inflection at the end. Okay? Anyone got a question for Richard?
I just wondered, obviously I've been to Prague. Do you think it's going to be a bit like Barcelona? Unfortunately, it's just going to be Airbnb destination for people on stag do's, hen do's, and so on and so forth. What do you think the future of Prague is going to be? Because Barcelona, obviously in Vienna, and those people are struggling with the way to tourism, perhaps losing their soul.
Okay.
So the question was, do you think that Prague will end up like great tourist destinations like Barcelona, Vienna and other places who have ended up kind of becoming Airbnb hostelries and losing their soul? What do you see in Prague's future, especially in regards to tourism and its unique character?
It's already a very long way down that road, a very long way down that road. This is a kind of disease that's infecting most interesting places. Reykjavik in Iceland is just completely occupied by Airbnb people. It's got a tiny population, Reykjavik, as does the whole of Iceland, but they get something like 3 million people through the island every year. Prague is the same. It's losing its character, and they're well aware of that too. Many of those fabulous apartments in the old town and the new town have been made into Airbnb locations. The pubs are very touristy, directed towards tourists. I don't miss you wouldn't wish communism on those people again, but yeah, man, I kind of miss the old communist shops in some ways. They were dingy, but really weird and fabulous. Like there used to be shops that sold mineral water, just mineral water, different kinds of mineral water from different parts of Bohemia for different ailments. You know, you take this mineral water from Galovivari for arthritis or whatever. And there was a shop that I went into that sold nothing but bookmarks and ex libris slips and little tiny little hardback editions of Shakespeare's sonnets in Czech. I mean, I loved all of that. There was a chocolate shop that sold like 20 different kinds of chocolate from all parts of the Soviet bloc, like Cuba and Hungary and whatever, in these dinky old wrappers. And the wrappers were glorious and fabulous and old-fashioned. The chocolate was like sawdust and completely inedible. But now, tourist shops everywhere, like the tourist shops we have in any main drag in Australia that sell, you know, plastic boomerangs and shot glasses and tea towels. It's the same in Prague. Shop after shop that sells little bottles of absinthe, fridge magnets, Kafka tea towels, but not Kafka's books. Yeah, it's pretty grim. And I don't know if I have a right to complain. I mean, when I'm there as a tourist as well, I suppose. So it's all very well for me to stand there and go, well, I should stay, but the rest of you should clearly leave. That's not fair. There are still pubs that are there in Prague, in the centre of Prague, which just don't have any sandwich boards out the front, which the Praguers used to keep to themselves. And that always makes me feel a bit sad, because that's not how it was in 1990 when I first went there. So there is a movement to do something about this. There's a new mayor of Prague who looks like a really interesting guy from the Pirate Party, who's a really interesting guy, who they're talking about dealing with Airbnb to limit its infiltration into Prague and do something about it. Otherwise, they're going to wake up one day and not have their city anymore. So it's still a real threat.
I guess we'll know it's over when they start selling kangaroo scrotum coin purses and
yeah.
kangaroo paw bottle openers.
Yeah, that's right.
We've got a question from Facebook Live from Karen, and actually it's a question I was going to ask Karen. You did mention, you know, how beautiful the broken teeth of the old Jewish cemetery in the ghetto were, and Karen wanted to know, having been in Prague last September and loving it, and having loved it, did you find any of the places that In Excess filmed Never Tear Us Apart?
Yes. That's just at the foot of the Charles Bridge. I think it's actually on Camper Island, where you see old floppy-haired bugger like, what's his name, Michael Hutchins singing, "Never tear us apart," down, 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 like that. But Prague in the background doesn't seem to fit that film clip. I don't know why. Yes, and it is kind of annoying actually. So you go, I think that's where Michael Hutchins filmed Never Tear Us Apart. It just bleeds a little bit more of the romance out of Prague to notice those things about the place.
Any other questions in the room?
Go on, ask me anything. Go right ahead.
While you're thinking of a question, we've got a question from Sarah. She said, "Hi Richard, which of your books did you enjoy reading the most?"
Reading the most?
Writing the most.
Oh, well they're both good questions, because I enjoyed writing Ghost Empire the most, I think. Although Sagaland was a real joy too. That was because I could write that with my friend Kari, and that was such a pleasure co-writing a book with a writer who I really admire. I enjoyed them both very much. This took much longer to write, this book, and at times I wondered if I'd ever get to the end of it. And this is now down to about, I think it's about 135,000 words or something. My first manuscript was at 175,000, which was way too long. And fortunately, my wonderful editor helped me weed the garden of the manuscript. I had to fight harder for this book. I enjoyed writing the chapter on the second culture the most, I think, in this one. That was the one I was expecting to enjoy the least. That's the period that I read from 1969 up to 1988, the bit in between the Prague Spring, the Soviet invasion, and the Velvet Revolution. The sheer weirdness of that time and the importance of rock and roll as a centre, as a focus of the whole outside culture from the official communist culture was actually ended up being really pleasurable to write. But I still think, there's something like that first book you write when you realise, oh my God, I've done it. It's there, and I still, for months and months afterwards, I'd still look at it on the shelf and go, oh, that's there. I actually did do that, and it made me very, very happy. And looking at this makes me really absurdly happy, I have to say. Looking at this book, each book I write feels it's lovely in a way it's hard to describe. And going back and reading it, I freely I go back and read passages from my books to go, was that as good as I remember it, or was that not good, or whatever, just to check that it's still there or something. Yeah. So I've gotten a lot of pleasure out of writing these books.
When you say you like to check it's still there, it's no pun intended, right, Richard?
No, there was no pun intended.
Okay, I was just checking.
Yeah.
I was just checking. What is your writing process? I mean, you're so busy, as the host of Australia's most popular podcast. And those of you who are locals may have seen Richard walking down Darling Street, looking at a book, doing research, marking it up for yet another wonderful conversation. How do you fit that plus your writing into a day?
Well, part of that was inveigling Sarah Konowski to host the program on Thursdays and Fridays. That's been a real help. That gives me a Friday to work on my writing. But I sort of work in and around. I haven't taken a day off in about 3 years. I just work all weekend and work early in the morning, and in the final couple of months I really had to build up a lot of momentum because it just wasn't getting done. It was taking forever to write, and so I don't know, I just find spaces in the gaps. I wrote a lot of Ghost Empire on the bus when I was living in Brisbane. I was living in Brisbane at the time, just getting the bus into the ABC, sitting there writing on an iPad because no one can bother you on the bus. It's really nice place to write. Getting up early in the morning. I'm quite disorganised. While I was in Ubud, at the Ubud Writers Festival last year, we befriended Lucy Ingalls, a British historian who wrote a wonderful history of opium. And she told me, I spent 2 years on research and then spent 1 year writing the book. And I went, wow, how do you do that? Like, I research and write at the same time because I can't wait to get started. So my process is messy. I had to have a lot of stern conversations with myself in the shower. You get up in the morning and you're nutting over a thing that just won't sort of work itself out. You have to go, now, what are you trying to do here, Richard? What are you doing? What are you trying to achieve? What's the problem? And then you have to sort of have this strange conversation in the shower, which makes your family think you're mad. And then then saying what the problem is helps you solve the problem. So my process is really messy and untidy. I collect vast amounts of research. The bibliography is disgracefully long in this book, and just pile it up and keep burrowing into the internet, buying books, reading them, and extracting what I need. One of the things about doing Conversations as a program, it has meant I am able to glean information from books very quickly, and as you say, quite rightly, I have learned how to read and walk at the same time because I've had to. Yeah, that happens. That's happened. Terrifyingly happened to me once when I was a student. And why are there always attractive women around when that happens too? I don't know why. Walking into a telegraph pole, and it's always those metal ones. Because if it was like a proper wooden one, I'd see it. But the narrow ones, and they make a clanging noise when they hit your forehead, so everyone turns around and looks, and there's this kind of idiot there with a book reeling, trying to look like nothing's gone wrong.
And if he's really unlucky, he bumps into me.
Oh, yeah. Then I get no more work done for the day.
Now, before we go, tell us, you've just done this marathon of 3.5 years into the Golden Maze and come back out the other side. Do you have another book in you, and what do you think it might be about?
I have a few ideas that are rattling around at the moment. either to write another history of a place, or to do something completely different. And I'm just letting that settle. I think that process is ought to be a gentle one, where you just put the ideas in front of you and see which one you keep returning to, and which one you keep talking about, and which one you're thinking about all the time. And I'm still in that process at the moment. We're trying to figure out what I want to do next. And I have a few ideas, but I'm not ready to commit what that idea is yet, I think. I'll wake up one day and then it'll be there, I think. I'm trying to let my subconscious mind solve those problems too. I'm a great believer in that. I know you are as well, Sunil. Letting the subconscious mind solve problems, or figure out what it is you really want, what you really want to write about, and how to ask for that. It's an odd process. I've noticed this again and again when you write history, and maybe the process is similar for fiction. If you need a story, you just ask for it and it comes to you. It's a weird thing. If you ask for it the right way, it's almost like a prayer or something. If you say, oh, I need something here, and you are sort of looking for it, but as you sort of mosey around the material, the story tends to walk right up to you like a friendly dog or something and ask to have its head patted. This has happened to me again and again. It's an odd process. It feels like the universe is being generous to you. But I think asking for that story in the right way is important.
And hopefully, perhaps, like Yaroslav returning to Wenceslas Square 21 years after he left, you may find that story, like he may have found the son of a Russian tank commander.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and encouraging story, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, you can find out more about Richard, his conversations and his many other endeavours at his website, richard-fidler.com. The Golden Maze is published by ABC Books and HarperCollins, and you can, of course, get a copy signed by Richard and a little bit of a chat. He'll be signing at the desk outside, as well as, if you're on Facebook Live, make sure you order on the Roaring Stories website, and you will get a signed copy from Richard with free postage. Don't forget to go onto the Roaring Stories website, roaringstories.com.au, to sign up to the newsletter for more events, great discounts, newsletters, interviews with your favourite authors, including a few very well curated Spotify playlists and more. And I really do hope that we will be able to see you again at another Roaring Stories author event. We will be delving into Stalin's wine cellar, the depths of which are buried in the mists of history, next week at the Royal Oak and on FB Live. But if we don't see you then, I hope we'll see you in the store as well. Thank you, I'm Sunil Badami. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.